99% of the people holding Flare right now are asking the same question everyone in this space always asks. When does the price move? That's the wrong question. And it's been the wrong question this entire time. Because while retail attention stayed locked on a chart that's down roughly 89% from its all-time high, a specific list of institutions quietly built real operational infrastructure directly into this network, one piece at a time, over the last year and a half. Nobody's actually laid out that full list in one place and asked the question that actually matters. Not when does the price move. The real question is why some of the most conservative, risk-averse institutions in finance and technology chose this specific network to build on while it was trading at a fraction of its former value, and what that decision actually implies about what these institutions know that the broader retail market currently doesn't. And let's go through this list one institution at a time, because the pattern only becomes obvious once you see all of them laid out together instead of scattered across a dozen. Separate headlines nobody bothered to connect. Start with Google Cloud, because this is the one that should have gotten more attention than it did. In January of last year, Google Cloud signed on as both a validator and a data provider on Flare's network. Sit with what that actually means. A validator role means Google Cloud is directly participating in securing Flare's consensus mechanism, taking on real operational responsibility for the network's integrity. A data provider role means Google Cloud is feeding external data directly into Flare's Oracle system, the exact infrastructure the entire network is built around. This is not Google Cloud renting out server space to a crypto startup. This is one of the 3 largest cloud computing providers on the planet choosing to take on direct, ongoing technical responsibility for a specific blockchain's core security and data infrastructure. Companies at Google scale do not make that kind of commitment casually, and they do not make it without extensive internal technical evaluation that most of the retail market watching this assets chart never sees. Think about what it actually costs an organization like Google Cloud to run validator infrastructure, because it clarifies why this decision carries more weight than a typical partnership announcement. Running a validator node isn't a passive endorsement. It requires dedicated engineering resources, ongoing maintenance, security monitoring, and genuine operational accountability for keeping that infrastructure online and functioning correctly. Around the clock. A company the size of Google doesn't allocate that kind of ongoing resource commitment to networks it considers speculative or likely to fail. The decision to take on that responsibility reflects an internal judgment that Flare's underlying architecture and its long-term viability was worth the engineering investment required to support it at Google's own operational standards. Now, BitGo, because this is where the institutional custody story gets real. In June of last year, BitGo rolled out regulated custody services for FLR and Songbird's SGB token. BitGo holds a BIT license in the state of New York, one of the most demanding regulatory frameworks for digital asset custodians anywhere in the world, and its platform serves as the preferred custodian for many of the largest exchanges and financial platforms operating in this space. When BitGo builds custody infrastructure for a specific asset, that's a direct signal about which networks institutional clients are actually asking to access, because BitGo doesn't build regulated custody products speculatively. Flare CEO Hugo Fillion described this partnership directly as a key milestone in the network's institutional journey. And he was right to frame it that way, because custody infrastructure is exactly the unglamorous foundational layer that has to exist before any larger institution can responsibly hold a position at scale. Understand why regulated custody specifically matters more than almost any single piece of infrastructure in this entire list. Institutional capital, particularly the kind sitting inside publicly traded companies, pension funds, or regulated financial entities, is legally and structurally prohibited from touching an asset without a compliant custody solution in place. It doesn't matter how promising a network's technology looks or how compelling its yield opportunities are if there's no regulated, insured, audited way to hold that asset. The overwhelming majority of institutional capital simply cannot participate at all. BitGo building that infrastructure specifically for FLR and SGB removed exactly that barrier. And the timing of that rollout, landing in the same week as a 9-figure institutional treasury announcement, was not a coincidence. Here's where this story gets genuinely significant. Because BitGo's custody rollout wasn't happening in isolation. In the same week, Vivo Power, a company listed on the NASDAQ, became the first major publicly traded institution to deploy an XRP-centric treasury strategy directly onto Flare, committing $100 million in XRP to the network's DeFi ecosystem. Read that figure again. $100 million from a publicly traded company allocated specifically to build yield-generating infrastructure through Flare's F-Asset system, using BitGo as the exclusive over-the-counter trading desk and custodian for the acquisition. Vivo Power's own leadership was explicit about why. Kevin Chen, the company's executive chairman and CEO, said it plainly. It's no longer enough to simply hold XRP. The duty to shareholders is to make it productive. That's not a marketing quote. That's a publicly traded company's chief executive telling shareholders on the record that Flare's infrastructure was the mechanism chosen to fulfill that fiduciary duty. Consider the accountability structure sitting underneath that statement, because it's genuinely different from how most crypto partnerships get framed. As a NASDAQ-listed company, Vivo Power's leadership carries direct legal and fiduciary responsibility to shareholders for how corporate capital gets deployed. That means the decision to route $100 million, specifically through Flare's F-Asset system, wasn't a marketing choice made by a communications team. It was a capital allocation decision made by executives who can be legally accountable if that decision turns out to have been reckless or poorly diligenced. Vivo Power raised $121 million in private capital specifically to fund this strategy, and the fact that a rigorous evaluation process, in the company's own words, led directly to Flare as the chosen infrastructure layer says something meaningful about how that technology actually performed under genuine institutional scrutiny. The mechanism behind that decision deserves real explanation, because it's the actual technical bridge connecting every institution on this list back to the same underlying thesis. Flare's F-Asset system takes assets like XRP, which were never built with native smart contract functionality, and creates a fully collateralized, trustless representation called FXRP that can operate inside Flare's EVM-compatible DeFi ecosystem. That means XRP holders, for the first time, can access lending, staking, and liquidity provision without giving up the underlying security model of the asset itself, and without needing to trust a centralized custodian to hold their tokens while they do it. Vivo Power's $100 million allocation represented the first genuinely institutional scale validation of that entire system. And it didn't happen because of a marketing campaign. It happened because Vivo Power's leadership conducted what they described as a rigorous technical evaluation before choosing Flare specifically as the infrastructure layer for this strategy. There's a specific structural detail worth understanding about how Vivo Power's strategy actually functions, because it clarifies why this partnership matters beyond the headline dollar figure. The company designed what it calls a regenerative treasury model, generating yield through Flare protocols like Firelight, and systematically reinvesting that income back into its core XRP position, creating a compounding cycle rather than a one-time allocation. That's a fundamentally different relationship with a network than simply parking capital and waiting. It's an ongoing, structurally dependent relationship where Vivo Power's own treasury performance is now directly tied to Flare's infrastructure continuing to function reliably over the long term, which is exactly the kind of dependency an institution wouldn't build without genuine confidence in what they were building on top of. Now, Kraken, because this is the piece that connects Flare's institutional custody and treasury story directly to retail accessibility. In April of last year, Kraken began listing USDT with direct withdrawal support to Flare wallets, meaning users holding stablecoins on one of the most established, longest-running cryptocurrency exchanges in the industry can move that liquidity directly onto Flare's network without friction. That might sound like a minor technical detail compared to a $100 million institutional treasury allocation, but it's actually the piece that makes everything else on this list functional at scale. Institutional infrastructure without a liquid, accessible on-ramp for capital to actually flow through it remains theoretical. Kraken's integration is exactly the kind of unglamorous plumbing that makes Google Cloud's validator role and BitGo's custody infrastructure into something that can actually process real volume rather than sitting as an impressive but underutilized piece of technical architecture. Think about the practical chain of events Kraken's integration actually enables, because it closes a loop that would otherwise leave a genuine gap in this entire ecosystem. A retail user holding stablecoins on Kraken can now withdraw directly to a Flare wallet, immediately gaining access to the same assets Faucet's infrastructure, Vivo Power, used for its institutional treasury. Secured by the same validator set Google Cloud participates in, with the option to eventually move those assets into BitGo's regulated custody if their position grows large enough to warrant it. That's a genuinely complete pipeline, from retail on-ramp through institutional-grade custody, built by 4 separate organizations that never needed to coordinate with each other to create it, because each one was independently solving their own piece of the same underlying problem. And now the piece that ties this entire list back to its origin, because it's the connection almost nobody covering this space bothers to mention anymore. Ripple's own investment arm, Xspring, made a strategic investment in Flare Networks back in 2019, years before any of the developments covered in this video took place. That early investment wasn't a coincidence. Flare was built from the ground up specifically to bring smart contract functionality to assets like XRP that were never designed with that capability natively. And the entire facet system that Vivo Power, Google Cloud, and BitGo are all now building around traces directly to that original architectural decision. Vivo Power's own public materials describe Flare explicitly as a network backed by Ripple Labs. That's not a retail marketing narrative manufactured after the fact. That's the actual origin story of why this specific network exists in the form it does today. And it's the reason every subsequent institutional development on this list connects back to the same underlying thesis about XRP needing programmable, DeFi-ready infrastructure that its own base ledger was never built to provide. It's worth being precise about the age of that Xspring investment, because overstating it would undercut the honest framing. This entire video is built around 2019, is genuinely early, years before any of the other institutional developments covered here, and it would be misleading to imply Ripple has been an active, ongoing operational partner in every subsequent decision Flare has made since. And what that early investment actually represents is validation of the founding thesis itself. The idea that XRP specifically needed a programmable DeFi layer built around it, at a moment when almost nobody else in the industry was taking that idea seriously. Everything that's happened since the Faucet's system, the FXRP token, Vivo Power's treasury strategy, has been Flare's own team executing on that original thesis, with each subsequent institutional partner independently arriving at the same conclusion Xspring reached years earlier. Here's the thing, nobody's actually answering when they cover Flare's price chart in isolation. If you laid out this exact list of institutions to someone with zero context, a major cloud computing provider running validator infrastructure, a regulated custodian, building compliance, storage, a NASDAQ-listed public company committing 9 figures in treasury capital, one of the industry's most established exchanges building direct liquidity rails, and an early strategic investment from the very company's flagship asset. This entire system was built to serve. Nobody would guess that Networks token was trading down 89% from its all-time high. That gap between the caliber of institutional infrastructure actually built and the price reflecting almost none of it is the actual story. And it's the question nobody in the space has bothered to answer honestly. Why does this specific combination of institutional validation exist underneath an asset the broader market has almost entirely stopped paying attention to? Part of the answer is simply timing. Every one of these developments happened during a period when Flare's price was already deep into a multi-year decline, meaning each individual announcement got absorbed into a broader narrative of this asset just keeps falling, rather than being read as evidence that something structurally different was happening underneath the chart. Part of the answer is that institutional infrastructure stories are genuinely less exciting to cover than price predictions, meaning even when Google Cloud takes on a validator role or a NASDAQ-listed public company commits $100 million in treasury capital, that news competes poorly for attention against whatever asset happens to be pumping that particular week. And part of the answer, the part worth sitting with the longest, is that institutions building infrastructure and retail markets, pricing an asset operate on completely different timelines, using completely different information, arriving at completely different conclusions about the same underlying set of facts. This is where the genuine awe in the story actually sits, and it's worth taking seriously rather than rushing past. None of these institutions on this list are speculative retail traders chasing a narrative. Google Cloud conducted its own internal evaluation before committing to run validator and data provider infrastructure. BitGo built regulated custody products specifically because institutional clients were requesting access to this exact asset. Vivo Power's leadership described a rigorous evaluation process before allocating 9 figures of shareholder capital. Kraken built direct withdrawal infrastructure because user demand justified the engineering investment. Every single one of these decisions required real due diligence, real technical resourcing, and real institutional accountability, made independently by organizations with no incentive to coordinate a narrative around an asset that was, for most of this period, deeply unfashionable to discuss. Think about the statistical improbability of 5 genuinely independent institutions operating in entirely different sectors with entirely different risk models and entirely different internal approval processes, all converging on the same network during the exact stretch when that network's price was telling the broader market to look elsewhere. A cloud computing company evaluates infrastructure reliability and technical soundness. A regulated custodian evaluates compliance risk and client demand. A publicly traded treasury operator evaluates fiduciary responsibility and yield potential. An exchange evaluates user demand and liquidity depth. None of these organizations were reading the same internal memo or responding to the same marketing campaign. They arrived at overlapping conclusions through entirely separate evaluation processes, which is precisely why this pattern is worth taking seriously instead of dismissing as coordinated type. That's the scale worth sitting with. Not a single influencer-driven pump, not a coordinated marketing campaign, but 5 genuinely independent institutional decisions made by a cloud computing giant, a regulated custodian, a publicly traded treasury operator, a major exchange, and the early strategic investment from the very company's flagship asset This entire system was built to serve, all converging on the same underlying network during the exact stretch when that network's price was telling the broader market to look elsewhere. 99% of the people holding Flare right now are watching a price chart that hasn't caught up to any of this yet. The other 1% are the ones who actually went and read what Google Cloud, BitGo, Vival Power, Kraken, and Ripple's own investment history were quietly building, verified, dated, sitting there in plain sight the entire time, waiting for the rest of the market to finally notice what these institutions already decided was worth building on. This video is for educational and informational purposes only. Nothing here constitutes financial, legal, or investment advice. Always do your own research and consult qualified professionals, before making any financial decisions. If this actually connected dots you hadn't seen laid out together before, hit like on this one. It tells the algorithm to put full verified institutional breakdowns like this in front of people who are tired of scattered headlines that never get tied together into the real picture. Subscribe if you want the update. And the moment any of these institutional relationships expand further, because Google Cloud, BitGo, Vivo Power, and Kraken all have real incentive to deepen these positions if the underlying thesis keeps proving out. Share this with the person who's been asking why Flare's price hasn't moved without ever actually looking at what's been quietly built underneath it. Drop a comment and tell me honestly, of these 5 institutions, which one do you think matters most for what happens next? And which one do you think the market still hasn't priced in at all? I want real reasoning, not just a name. 5 institutions, 1, the quiet thesis. The chart hasn't caught up yet. Have a great day. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and be sure to join my free Telegram community with the link on my channel where I post my daily crypto experience and arbitrage opportunities you can't get anywhere else. This is XRP Hobart signing off.